Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. In this episode, recorded on October 16th, 2014, Daniel and I spoke with Mr. Daniel Miller about the prospect of Texas seceding from the United States. Mr. Miller is the author of Line in the Sand and is the president of the Texas Nationalist Movement, which, according to its website, is the largest and oldest organization solely dedicated to the freedom and independence of Texas. You can follow the Texas Nationalist Movement at texnat.org. That's TEXNAT.org. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Texas-secession.
So tell us a little bit about your organization and what you do.
Sure. The Texas Nationalist Movement is the largest and oldest organization that is out there pursuing the political, cultural, and economic independence of Texas.
What are some goals that you have for the near future, say like 10 years?
Well, you know, one of the most interesting aspects of what we're doing, and people really and truly need to take the issue of Texas independence in a larger context. Both, you know, the way that the trend works globally and really in comparison with many of the other independence movements around the world. You know, we just had the issue with Scotland's referendum on independence. And, you know, it blows people away when you tell them that this was a process that took centuries for them. So, you know, for all intents and purposes, we're pretty much Johnny-come-latelys to this issue, as it is with most things over here in the Western Hemisphere. But that being said, you know, the contention of not just the Texas Nationalist Movement, but authors like John Nesbitt, who wrote Megatrends and Global Paradox, is that this is this trend toward self-determination is a global trend. And, you know, I think you look at it in the context of, or look at it from the standpoint that at the end of World War II, there were 54 recognized countries around the globe. At the end of the 20th century, there were 192. So, you know, where we are standing now, with Texas in particular, but really as a movement that is headed toward this self-determination and autonomy, is that in the next, say, 10 years, we're going to see outright Texas independence. I mean, that really is the goal, to see it sooner than that for us. But it is a trend. And with that, I think you're going to see essentially what is going to be the dissolution of the United States. There will be maps that are changed in North America.
Yeah, and I assume you saw the poll a few weeks ago that said about 24% of people in the United States wish their state seceded.
Yeah, and let me, and not to interrupt you, but there's something about that poll that drives me absolutely crazy, and it's that thing. I mean, if you take what you just said and you break it down, 24% of Americans want to see their state secede. Well, that's not how really you determine such things, right? Americans as a whole are, you know, so you have to take that poll, and that's what we did. It was a Reuters Ipsos poll, and it was a, you know, very well-respected poll, and the headlines are so misleading that came off of that poll. The best way to look at it is on a state-by-state basis, and here in Texas, you know, you look at the breakdowns here in Texas. It was 54% Republicans. You had about 49 to 50% independents, and even 25% of Democrats. But I think what should absolutely, you know, embolden those people that are harboring these feelings about independence and sort of withholding their support is that 18% undecided. That 18, the devil in the details here in Texas is that 18% undecided. Those are the people that we have to make the case to. And when you compile those numbers and you lay them over the electoral reality of what goes on here in Texas, what you find is that if a referendum were held tomorrow, there's a very likely chance that we would come in at 55% or better. And that's really what our goal is with the TNM. We want to see the people vote on this, and we believe the people of Texas are ready to see a vote on it.
Well, and if this issue were being discussed more frequently, because a referendum were approaching, then I I personally believe that more people would jump on board, but a lot of people think that it's perhaps far fetched. So how can you appeal to those people who might think that it sounds a little unreasonable?
Well, I think that folks that believe that it's unreasonable, I mean, you take that particular term and it really is sort of a passing the buck thing. I've been fairly blunt about this in relation to having conversations with people, that are on the other side or undecided or say things like this is unrealistic. And the bluntness comes in the fact that we need to start having some adult conversations about reality.
Sure.
And that's where a lot of people don't want to have those conversations. But the thing to understand for folks is that these conversations are being had all over the world. These conversations are happening. I mean, the one thing, and even though the Scottish referendum went down in flames, and I say went down in flames, I mean, it really wasn't a solid defeat. And there are a lot of things about that we can take lessons from. But the fact of the matter is that the SNP and the Yes campaign were able to sit down and have an adult conversation with Westminster over this and agree to at least put it to a vote. These are the types of conversations that are being had in many other places around the world. And only folks that want to ignore the realities are unwilling to have those conversations. And the realities are such is that Texas and many other states are on diverging paths politically, economically, and culturally. And so we can be that couple that everyone thinks, man, they really should get divorced because they fight all the time. We could be that miserable couple, or we can have some adult conversations about maybe it's time that we all kind of go our ways, and not saying that we can't be friends, but saying it's time for each of us to pursue our own destiny and become what it is that we were meant to be.
Since all of us have lived in Texas for at least a while, I'm sure we're familiar with some reasons for Texas independence, but some of our other listeners might not be. So could you give us about your top five reasons for Texas independence?
Wow, that's an interesting way to put it. Normally, when people say, "Hey, can you tell us why Texas should be independent?" I invariably say, "You just don't have enough time for me to run down the list." But let me just put it in this context, okay? Just so we understand. What we're talking about here, and if we were going to construct a Declaration of Independence, I'm sure that we would have a long list of grievances. There are a lot of issues that we've got. But what the main issues boil down to is, number one, for us, it's time. Texas has the 12th largest economy in the world right now. And the only thing that's holding us from moving up that list and experiencing economic prosperity that has just been, that is unprecedented among the American states or in North America is the overreaching federal government, which really sort of takes you to the second point, which is the federal system is broken. Our right of local self-government has become impaired, and it's echoed in Article 1, Section 1 of the Texas Constitution, where it says that the perpetuity of the Union depends on the right of local self-government unimpaired to all the states. So essentially, Article 1, Section 1 declares the Union dead, because if you go down the list of policy issues, you don't even have to list them out individually, but on so many fronts, we see that the federal government has encroached upon our right of local self-government, which really brings you to a third point, which is the fact that the federal system is in and of itself broken. What you have when the Union was first envisioned was I guess you would call it a federation, a union of equal and independent sovereign states. And what we have seen is that more and more of the power has shifted from some of the states to the others, whether it's economic. In other words, you have states like Texas that put more into the federal system than we get back out of it. And so you've got about 10 to 15 states that actually underwrite the rest of the union. And it's even more than that. I mean, we're seeing, whether it be in the issues of the checks and balances among the three branches of government, where we see the potential, or not just the potential, but the reality of the Supreme Court stepping out of bounds. Those issues are there, and the federal system is terminally broken. And that really kind of brings us to a fourth point, which is something that I mentioned earlier: the divergence that we have on the political, cultural, and economic fronts. You cannot ignore the fact that were Texas to make all the decisions, that many of those would be vastly different than the policies that come out of Washington, D.C., and the policies pursued by other states. So that divergence in and of itself creates tension and friction amongst the union and between Texas and the federal system. So that divergence is important. But really and truly, I think if you're going to take a fifth point, I think we just have to quote Sam Houston when he said, after Texas was annexed into the Union, that Texas will again lift its head and stand among the nations. Our belief is that it is that time right now. I think we all understand what Texas is, and I think we have a sense of what Texas could be if we were independent.
Absolutely. And continuing on with the economic point you made, Texas is very resource rich. I think there's about 1/3 of the natural gas reserves and 1/4 of the oil reserves in the U.S. in Texas. So it definitely seems to make sense economically. And of course, there's not really a federalist system anymore, as you touched on. But how do you think Texas independence could come about? You mentioned the possibility of a referendum. Do you think that would be the most likely way for it to come about, or do you think there's another way that we may see develop down the road?
Well, I think the referendum is what we want to have. You look at the trend, say, over the last 40 years, and invariably the independence that is achieved by so many of the nations, the referendum is the gateway, and ultimately that's what you want. Article 1, Section 2 of the Texas Constitution says that all political power is inherent in the people, and that they have the right to reform, alter, or abolish their form of government in such manner as they may think expedient. So at the end of the day, and it's been, and honestly, that portion of Article 1, Section 2 has been in every constitution that Texas has had since the Republic of Texas Constitution of 1836. So that is a very well ingrained principle here in Texas. So you're going to want to see a referendum, simply, if nothing else, just to uphold that principle of Article 1, Section 2. And that is ultimately what you want, because it needs to be a decision of the people that the people make consciously to go down that path, and the referendum is the best way to make that happen. There are other options, and those options are not as palatable as having the people of Texas go to the polls and vote. So that's why we advocate what we advocate, which is for a referendum to be held here in Texas. It's something that you see. It's common nowadays. It's customary for nations that are going out there and achieving their independence. It is historically sound from the viewpoint of Texas, and the law, from a lawful standpoint, is on our side. So it's definitely the way that you want to go.
Could you tell us what are some of the logistical challenges to setting up a referendum?
The challenges from a logistical standpoint are non-existent. I mean, it is as simple as getting the legislature to pass a bill calling for the referendum. That's it. The framework is in place to make that happen. As a matter of fact, the legislation that we have worked to get introduced in the last several sessions places calls for the referendum to be held on the same election as a constitutional amendment election. So that way there is no special election for it. It can be held during the usual cycle. So it takes away a lot of the logistical challenge in that regard. So that's not a problem. The challenge that we have, really and truly, that we're going to have to contend with once we get a referendum, is winning the referendum. And that's where, proponents of independence need to be very aware that once we get the ability to have the referendum, going out there and winning it is going to be important. It's important for everyone to understand that the fight over this will be over the 18% that are undecided, and those folks will make the difference. And we will be the recipients of probably one of the most expensive political campaigns in history. When they talk about the last presidential election was, I think, the first or possibly second billion-dollar campaign, it's important to understand that the Texas independence campaign, the no side, will probably spend twice that much money to get the people of Texas to vote no. So we have to be willing to go out there and see this thing all the way to the end. That is really the only logistical challenge that I see to making it happen, is just not only getting the vote, but winning the vote.
Now, how do you convince people that the potential reaction of Washington regarding the potential referendum, how do you convince people that that would not be a stumbling block and that would not be a reason to backtrack from supporting independence?
Well, when you talk about the potential reaction, that there are folks out there that are afraid on a lot of levels about what the reaction of the federal government will be. It's understandable, because there is this sense of trying to go back and put this thing in the context of the Civil War. If I had a dime for every time I heard, the U.S. will come invade, they did it before, or that was decided in the Civil War. If I had a dime for every time I did it, I would be able to fund the yes side of the campaign. $8. But the fact of the matter is that this is not 1861, right? This is I looked at the calendar today, 2014, and in 2014, places like this that go to the polls and vote on the right of self-determination don't get invaded militarily, okay? This is not Somalia. This is not some third world country. So if the United States federal government is keen on those principles that they say they uphold, and as a matter of fact send troops overseas to uphold, then they will not react poorly on this. Now, will they be pouty? It's possible. Well, they may be pouty. But the one thing that people need to understand is, and if you want to put it in real terms, especially about the military reaction, is back in, I believe it was 2010 or 2011, there was a Zogby poll that was conducted where they polled active duty military personnel, and they asked them, do you believe that a state has a right to secede from the Union? And essentially half of the military said absolutely yes. Well, you look at that in practical terms, that survey dealt with not just enlisted, but all the way up through the officer ranks. And it's going to be very difficult for the federal government, if they were to even countenance doing this, it's going to be very difficult for them to prosecute a war against any state that peacefully votes, to declare their independence, with half of the military not backing that play. So, if we know that, they know that. And really and truly, the reaction that they're going to have is going to be ahead of the vote. And, of course, through the campaigning and everything else. And they may be a little pouty when it comes time to sit down and negotiate the issues that we have to negotiate. But I don't foresee that they can stop us, because the one trump card that people need to understand that we hold is that if the federal government reacts poorly to any state peacefully voting to leave the Union, that poor reaction can in and of itself go ahead and collapse the rest of the Union, because the other states will not tolerate it. I would say this, and I'm not exaggerating, but I believe that if on Independence Day for whatever state, let's say Texas, Independence Day +1, if the United States federal government sent military troops into Texas or militarily retaliated against Texas, Texas Independence Day +2 would see the independence days of many, many other states because they would not tolerate it.
Sure, and the fact that we even have to discuss this point really shows the level and depth of these grievances, because obviously this goes against the federalist system that was initially set up, and it goes against the voluntary nature of the original Union that was written into the Articles of Confederation and that was expressed at the state ratifying conventions. Moving away from the issue of how Washington might react, though, how do you think other countries would react to Texas voting for independence?
Well, I think, honestly, I think they would be very welcoming. But you really don't know how governments will react. I mean, you look and see what some of the reactions have been related to Scotland and Catalonia and places like that, and you see some of these countries that are, they were trying to get the Scottish people to vote no. I mean, obviously there was a vested interest for them, those particular countries that chimed in on it, to see the UK as a whole. All the other countries are going to look at it through the lens of their interests, because that's what countries do ultimately, right? So, but one thing that we know and it's more than anecdotal evidence, but one thing that we know for sure is that countries around the world like Texas. They not only like Texas, they like to do business with Texas. And if they see an opportunity to enhance their trade and continue to trade with us, and they see some economic advantage, they'll jump on board. But I think what we have to deal with here also is this kinship that places like Texas and especially through our independence movement have with other countries that are pursuing their own independence movements. You look at, for example, the relationship that we have with people in the SNP in Scotland, several different groups in Catalonia, the New Flemish Alliance in Belgium, the ties that we have forged with the folks in Venice and Italy, and then, of course, the other independence movements in North America. There is a sort of a kinship here. So I believe that the world will react however they are going to react based on their interest. But that in and of itself should not affect what we decide here in Texas, because ultimately the decision for Texas independence, not only does it not belong in the hands of the federal government, it doesn't belong in the hands of anyone else in the world but Texans.
Absolutely. How many votes do you have so far for getting that referendum out there? It sounds like y'all are closer than I would have thought.
I will tell you this, it's very difficult. We've got essentially here in Texas in electoral politics, in the state house, we've got a chicken and egg situation. And it's the only way. I mean, really, truly, it's the best analogy for it. You've got a standoff here between the people and their elected representatives. The elected representatives want political cover, right? They want to know that the people of Texas are going to have their back if they call for a referendum, if they file a bill calling for a referendum. They want to know that the people will have their backs. But the people are reluctant to step out and support these legislators or offer their support to these legislators until they see some sign of good faith, a.k.a. them introducing the bill. So we spend an inordinately large amount of time when the legislature is in session refereeing between these two sides, encouraging the people to stand around some of these legislators, and then encouraging the legislators to do the will of the people. People want to see this happen. So, it's kind of a rough deal. Now, back in 2009, there was a bill filed called HCR 50. And, we started engaging the legislature in 2009. There was a bill filed, and I say it was a bill, it's a resolution. But there was a resolution filed called HCR 50, which they called it a 10th Amendment resolution. And in dealing with the legislators, we agreed that we would give them that session to pass HCR 50, and we would see how it would transpire. Well, it did not. I mean, it didn't go through. It made it through the House. It ran out of time in the Senate. And so the next session, we immediately started pounding on those guys to give us a referendum. We wanted them to file the bill. And we did not get it. And so the next session, what we had was, 2011. Okay, this last session, we had State Representative James White. He's actually out of the Tyler County, Woodville area, down southeast Texas. But Representative White came very close to filing our bill as it was written, but at the last moment wound up taking the referendum language out and filing essentially the rest of the bill, and it was numbered HCR 77. So with that in mind, and understanding that you've got a lot of shuffling of the deck chairs, okay, you've got a brand new, you're going to have a brand new pack of top leadership and state government. You've got a lot of brand new faces in the legislature, both on the House side and the Senate side. You're going to have we've got an opportunity here now, particularly with the polling here in Texas showing a surge of support for independence. I believe that we've got a great opportunity in this session to get a bill filed, if not on a binding referendum, at least a non-binding referendum, which would serve to really kind of push this thing forward.
Excellent. It's very encouraging to hear that. One more thing I want to hear your response to. Sometimes you hear this argument that secession would be illegal or it would be unconstitutional, and we've touched on this a little bit, and it usually seems really disingenuous because it tends to come from people who don't really care when something's constitutional, except when when the U.S. might get smaller. When the unit of government may shrink. But if you could just really quickly comment on why secession would be legal and why it would be why the constitutionality of that is not an issue, and why the Texas v. White case would not prohibit secession like so many people think it does.
Yeah, Texas versus White. Let me address that one first, because that is always the lifeboat for somebody whose arguments against Texas independence are failing miserably.
Yes,
that is their refuge of last resort. And Texas versus White exists, and there are numerous problems with Texas versus White. I addressed them in my book, Line in the Sand. The problems are way too numerous to get into. But look, let's all face it: the Supreme Court has made bad rulings before. And those rulings have been reversed later. If anyone has any question, go read up on the Dred Scott case. But the fact of the matter is that the Texas versus White has no play, because if Texas versus White is in force, then the Union is dead, according to Article 1, Section 1 of the Texas Constitution. So let's get down to what the legal framework is, or the legal argument is. The Union as is, and was mentioned before, is supposed to be a union of 50 sovereign states governed by the United States Constitution. Now, what's important to understand in the U.S. Constitution is the 10th Amendment, and the 10th Amendment says that any powers not specifically granted to the federal government are reserved to the states. If you look for the issue of secession or state withdrawal, the Constitution is absolutely silent on the issue. And so where the Constitution is silent, those powers are reserved to the states. Okay, so that means that the issue of secession or withdrawal is a state issue, a singular state issue. Not everybody has to vote on it. Not everybody gets a say in it. It's reserved to the states. Okay, so with that being said, that means that in Texas, Article 1, Section 1 is in play. Article 1, Section 1, as I stated earlier, said that the perpetuity of the Union depends on the right of local self-government unimpaired to all the states. Therefore, if that is the case, then Article 1, Section 2 is invoked, where it says that all political powers inherent in the people, all free governments are founded on their authority and instituted for their benefit, and the people have at all times the inalienable right to reform, alter, abolish their form of government in such manner as they may think expedient. So ultimately, the issue, because the U.S. Constitution is silent, is shifted to Texas. Here in Texas, the issue is left up to the people to decide. So that is in and of itself the entire argument, but it's even more basic than that. And it's simply this, is that the people have the right of self-determination. That is a first principle. It is a fundamental right, regardless of what the U.S. Constitution says or the Texas Constitution says. The fact of the matter is that the people have and will always retain the right of self-determination.
No, and of course, when the Union was set up, the people of the states were the ones with the sovereignty, and they get to choose how to exercise that sovereignty. And opting to secede would just be exercising that sovereignty in a different way than they previously had been doing.
Well, Adam, I mean, look at it this way. I mean, if anyone were to suggest that it would be illegal for a country to withdraw from the United Nations, it would be ludicrous. But that's essentially the same argument they make. You know,
Right.
they you know, and so you tell people that, and they don't look. They're not used to looking at the United States as United Nations. But you know, the words nation and state are often very synonymous. You know, we're talking about essentially Texas and Oklahoma and Louisiana and all these other states are essentially nation states, as the Union was originally designed. And so, you know, if the nature of the Union has changed since Texas came on board, well, there's yet another reason for Texas independence, because this is not what we signed on for. We didn't sign on to be part of some unitary American nation. We signed on to be a state, an equal partner in a union of states to maintain our right of local self-government. And at the moment that becomes impaired, which it has been, then the Union is dead.
Absolutely. Where can our listeners get some more information about the Texas National Movement?
Well, everything about our movement, for the most part, is at our website at texnat.org. That's TEXNAT.org.
Excellent. And what sorts of things will they find there about the movement?
Well, you'll be able to read about the organization, what our mission is, where our 15 points are, where we kind of break down what it is we do as an organization. There's a fairly extensive FAQ on the issue of Texas independence. We address issues that come up often. For example, one of the most asked questions is, if Texas becomes independent, what will happen to my Social Security? We address that is number one, of course, you know, followed by number two, which is the second most asked question: what will we do if Mexico invades? And I have to remind people on the calendar, it is not the 1830s anymore. It's 14. But we answer a lot of those, and including some very practical questions like if someone is in the military, can they join our organization? There at the website, people can also become a member of the organization. It is absolutely free to join us, and we welcome anyone who believes in our mission of Texas independence.
Well, it sounds good, and best of luck to you and your organization. Hopefully there's a lot of success down the road for this movement.
Absolutely.
It's very exciting to hear the things that you're doing, and to see the growth in this movement and the growth in support for Texas secession. So best of luck to you, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, gentlemen, thank you for having me on, and really do appreciate you tackling this topic in a very adult manner. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.